back to the early career of Roncalli, who, as we're seeing, and remember our whole point in studying Roncalli at this particular juncture is to illustrate the kind of people whom Pius XII set up. If all this information was clearly available at the time, if it's still on record to this day, it was available then as well. And this is somebody who we've seen already made nuncio to Paris by Pius XII. But we'll look more at his. What we're doing here is looking at his track record, which we have done and we'll do more of starting now. But remember, this is that is the immediate purpose of this. And we are looking very much here at how Vatican II happened. To a great extent, the study of the reign of Pius XII is the study of that. It is very much a mixed bag. Hopefully, at least that has been made clear by now, that the reign of Pius XII was very much a mixed bag. It was certainly long enough to be very mixed, and very mixed it was. Within those nearly 20 years, he did a great many very good things for the church, oversaw a great flourishing, which we've talked about, also provided a great deal of development of doctrine, provided also the definition of the Assumption as a dogma of faith, a defined dogma of faith. He provided a very great setup for the church in many different ways, and in all of those, according to all those aspects. Another one being the definition of the exact matter and form of holy orders. He provided that as well. Sacramentum Ordinis, 1947. But at the same time, you have the setup of all these people, including Roncalli, Montini, all came up during his reign, and also Bugnini, who was not he was not made a bishop of anything, but he was put in charge of certain things, we'll see, which positioned him perfectly to bring about the formation of the Novus Ordo Missae. And remember that in his, according to his own dating of the process, that began in 1948. So the year after, Pius XII did a very great service of providing Sacramentum Ordinis for the church, defining, laying down exactly what is required for the valid conferral of holy orders. The following year, who gets to start the process of moving towards the Novus Ordo under his reign as well, but Annibale Bugnini himself, whose name is one you can scarcely avoid spitting when you say it. Certainly among traditional Catholics in general, that is the case. You can't say Bugnini without immediate bad taste coming to your mouth. His name is so strongly associated with everything that the traditional movement was founded in reaction to. Remember that was the very beginning of the traditional movement. It was before anybody had looked closely enough at Vatican II to see that was the actual problem. And it all goes back straight to that. Before anybody had formed all of the coherent arguments that we now use to prove the vacancy of the Holy See, and at the same time how that does not in any way violate the indefectibility of the Church. Before any of that had been developed, before Bishop Guerrero had formulated the thesis, before any of that, the first reaction was to the new Mass itself, and it was Bugnini who brought that about. Of course, it was in many ways a gut reaction to the repulsiveness of the new Mass, which certainly is repulsive, which was not sufficient in itself to prove what the actual nature of the situation in the Church was and continues to be. But that's where it all started. People perceived this as something that is not Catholic somehow. And they were right. Their instincts were good. Of course, that had to be proven, and it has since been proven. The new Mass itself has been put under the microscope, and it's been shown exactly how bad it is. In fact, invalid in itself. To the point that even if you have a validly ordained priest celebrating it, it is still, you have to presume that is invalid. So even the process to bring about all of that came about that began during the reign of Pius XII. Not that he himself, not that it got to the point of producing anything intrinsically evil during his reign, of course not. But the process undeniably began then. You'd have to be in complete denial of of absolutely clear evidence to think otherwise. Have to deny that which is painfully obvious to assert otherwise. So, going back to this now, the Roncalli, he who came up during the reign of Pius XII, we're looking at the fact that he was very much in the camp of all of those who were opposed to St. Pius X. For one thing, he was on good terms with Cardinal Ferrari, who we've seen was in definite opposition to the most recently canonized pontiff, that he referred to the apostolic visitations to the Lombardy Seminary as apostolic vexations. So he couldn't even retain an external reverence in his own personal vexation, clearly. So one understands that these visitations displeased him, particularly those of Cardinal Boggiani, a fellow countryman and admirer of St. Pius X, the only bishop to, this is Father Ricosa quoting from his work, to my knowledge, to have written a pastoral letter against Don Sturzo. Remember, Don Sturzo was the founder of the Partito Popolare, the popular party in Italy, whose party got too involved in politics, started dragging the church into areas which are really not the concern of the church. So Boggiani's reports were not favorable. So we were talking about all the people who were opposed to St. Pius X. There were, in fact, those who were very much in agreement, as we saw the future Pius XII himself. Eugenio Pacelli was very much in favor, even though he was, as always, quiet about it. He was definitely no modernist himself, and was all for the suppression of modernism. So among those who actually agreed with St. Pius X and supported him, did their best to implement his efforts everywhere, was this Cardinal Boggiani, whose reports of Cardinal Ferrari, the state of Cardinal Ferrari's diocese and seminary, were not favorable. So Roncalli's biographer says, during the summer of 1911, the Lombardy seminaries received another apostolic visitor, Tomasi Boggiani, O.P., so Dominican cardinal. We don't know anything about the contents of this secret report, but his report on Milan and Cardinal Ferrari was published in 1974. Here's an excerpt from it. So we have here the Roncalli's biographer quoting himself this document. As for the modernist ideas, or those allied to modernist theories, it is certain that they are spread throughout the clergy, particularly among the young priests. And we'll see that Roncalli was clearly one of those among whom it was spreading. He was a member of the young clergy among whom modernist theories were spreading. The cardinal could not have not had knowledge of it, but he showed himself too tolerant. A double negative there can be a little bit confusing, but he's saying definitely Cardinal Ferrari knew about this. There's no way he could not have known about it. But he didn't suppress it. Also, he agreed to be the honorary president of a Congress of Secondary Schools, which was supposed to be held in September in Serrano, on this 50th anniversary of our national epic, a year so dear to Italians, as the letter of invocation proclaimed. So, we're in 1911 here. Does anybody remember what happened 50 years prior that might bring to mind the national epic of Italy that he's referring to? It was actually the actual proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy, whose aim was clearly to take over the Papal States in 1861, whose aim was clearly to take over the Papal States and form this anti-clerical, revolutionary Kingdom of Italy. That was proclaimed in 1861. And here you have Cardinal Ferrari agreeing to be part of a celebration of that. So yeah, this is 1911, long before, it's 18 years before the signing of the Lateran Accords, 1929. long before the resolution of the Roman question, in other words. And here he is clearly looking upon the proclamation of the Italian kingdom as something to celebrate, at a time when popes were still vigorously refusing to recognize even the existence of it. Remember, they were still calling the kings of Italy, the residents of the Quirinal Palace, the Dukes of Savoy. St. Pius X himself was certainly one of those who refused to visit anybody who had come to visit also the quote-unquote king of Italy. They refused. If you're going to go to them, you're not coming to us also. That was the idea. St. Pius X even refused to receive by that time, former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who had come also to visit the King of Italy. So if you're going to visit him, don't bother even knocking on my door, in essence. And indeed, he did not. Roosevelt did not. But the fact that St. Pius X would refuse to receive the former President of the United States is telling, of course. A former president is not the same thing as a sitting president, but nobody who has ever been president of the United States ceases to be prominent. And it was true even at the time. This is 1911. The United States was very much, isolationist at the time. As to say, very much kept to itself. There was not a great deal of interest in getting involved in the affairs of other nations at the time. Not like it is now. Anything happens anywhere in the world, the United States is involved in some way, usually in some bad way. It's very seldom that the American involvement in anything is good at this point. It causes further problems and exacerbates the trouble. At the very least, always with this idea that we have to be the policeman of the world, and we have to promulgate liberal Western democracy and all the immorality that goes with it everywhere. That's the idea. It's not in itself. It's not unjustified to help a nation bring its problems, even its internal problems, under control, or to intervene in foreign conflicts to bring about the end of bloodshed, for example. But that's never the aim. The aim is always ends up being keeping any kind of armed conflict going for decades, and with the idea of spreading the ideology of Western liberal democracy and everything that goes with that as far and wide as possible. But that was not the case at the time. So for better or worse, that was not the case at the time. In fact, remained that way even after the outbreak of the First World War. So the United States had to be aroused, and in the case of fact of both world wars, had to be aroused to sufficient anger in order for the general populace to clamor for this country to enter the war in question. So it was not even a former president of the United States is not the same thing as that would be now, but that is now, but still that is significant. So St. Pius X himself accused Cardinal Ferrari of attacking the integrally Catholic press. So remember that Pope Benedict XV did indeed very much go back on the policies of St. Pius X as far as promoting integralism, at least by that name. He said, if you're a Catholic, and that's it. Using any other label tends to promote division among Catholics. And there is something to that, of course. There is no such thing as a degree of being a Catholic. Someone either has the faith or does not. Yes, it is possible that someone be legally a member of the church while still also in some way being cut off from it. But somebody who actually is a member of the church and has the faith is a Catholic, and that is that. So the integrally Catholic press, that is to say all of the publications that supported and promoted the policies, the agenda tends to have a negative sense to it, but it's true, the program of St. Pius X, that is the integrally Catholic press that we're referring to here. So at the beatification process of St. Pius X in 1946, Don Paolo de Tot testified, "My journal, L'Unità Cattolica, was systematically fought by the archbishops of Pisa, Mafi, Florence, and more still, Milan," Cardinal Ferrari. And also Antonelli's report for the canonization of St. Pius X, adopting, because it was also the thought of St. Pius X, or Pius X, I guess, is in the canonization process, the proposition of the integralists that the modernizers were in a certain sense more dangerous than the modernists, presenting the same errors in a more subtle and insidious form. And that in Milan, if one taught the holy doctrine, there would be, on the other hand, much practical modernism. So that's absolutely correct, that the modernizers are in a way more dangerous than the modernists. In other words, the principle is something along the lines of it, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. As to say, an enemy who's actually up front and clear about being an enemy is less dangerous than an enemy who is subtle about it. Because he might get the chance to stab you in the back. Whereas an enemy who just in this case, somebody who's clearly adopts heretical propositions that were all the really heresies, those things which are directly contrary to faith that the modernists hold, such as the evolution of doctrine, the evolution of dogma, meant in the sense of change, of substantial change. People who come out and explicitly say that, well, they're easily found out and censored. Whereas modernists figured out it was precisely because of the methods of the measures taken by St. Pius X that the modernists figured out that we can't do that. If we do that, we'll be found out. They clearly already had some idea of it, but in his time they were much bolder. They were much bolder than they were after that. On the whole, there were still some who were pretty bold. You may have seen in the Modern Errors course, Karl Rahner, for example. He was bold as brass in what he said. But many others were much craftier about it. And they got through by means of that. So, the modernizers are, in fact, worse than the modernists because they all hold the same thing, ultimately. Somebody who clearly understands the problems of modernism and still will not disown those ideas, but still retains them to some extent. If he continues to push that agenda with subtlety, he's much worse than somebody who just comes out and says what he thinks, such as Alfred Loisy or George Tyrrell and those horrible characters who were taken down by St. Pius X. So this is Father Ricosa saying this at the top of the page, at the top of the right-hand column on page 34. If Ferrari, Radini, Mercier, Roncalli, Maffei, and Bonamelli were not modernists, and that question mark right there is put in by Father Ricosa to mean even that is something that we can call into question, whether they may actually have been, perhaps not, as we said before, as we saw, not in the manner of Loisy, who was not clever, in a sense, about what he was doing. He just came out and said it. If they were not modernists, at least not in the manner of Tyrrell or Loisy, they were nevertheless modernizers, more dangerous than modernists themselves. And we'll see that there was nobody more slippery than Roncalli himself. So they, or some of them anyway, may have fought modernism by words, but indeed they wished to eliminate the anti-modernists, as Roncalli's biographer involuntarily proves. Don Roncalli's ally in Milan, Cardinal Ferrari, went public. In a pastoral letter in 1908, he denounced the anti-modernists who, he said, were just as bad and just as modern, the word now having lost all meaning, as those they attacked. In certain reviews and newspapers, warding off modernism involves excesses. This is a Cardinal Ferrari. Modernizer, certainly in the sense that he has sympathy for and modernism and attacks those who attack it. And clearly, again, this is just complaining. He doesn't like the fact that modernism is being attacked and is always going to complain about it. That's when people start saying things that sound nasty but are very, in fact, very vague. That's just a way of complaining. That's what he's doing here, that they're just as modern as those they attack. What does that mean? living at the same time, yes, but that's not what it means to be modern, obviously. And what you look at that and think, what is he even saying when he says they're just as modern as those they attack? And also this assertion, in certain reviews and newspapers, wording of modernism involves excesses. Well, which ones, for one thing? I mean, it is possible that somebody be excessively zealous, or could be possessed of a bitter zeal, that is to say, in something. Rather than saying excessively, we'll say to have a disordered zeal, bitter zeal. That is possible, but would he please prove which ones, show us which ones we're talking about here? And so he says these anti-modernist zealots, zelanti, discover modernism all over the place, and even manage to throw suspicion on those who are very far removed from it. What I probably should say is, I say probably because it's impossible to say whom exactly he has in mind, but certainly concerning many of them, those should even manage to throw suspicion on those who don't want it to fall on them. Because the modernists themselves never, certainly not after St. Pius X, certainly not after St. Pius X started to take measures against them, actually applied that term to themselves. And in fact denied that what St. Pius X condemned was what they held. Or they would say that the modernism of St. Pius X is not the modernism of the modernists, which is absurd, obviously. St. Pius X identified it exactly. You can see it everywhere. You can see this is exactly what the modernists said and did at his time and subsequently. You can verify that through your own reading. So he discovered it and exposed it with perfect accuracy, and they just didn't like that. So they complained about it to the point got to the point they were nailed down so well that all they could do is deny that. That's just not what we think. It's not what we think. No. But they should please tell us what they actually do think and prove that it is orthodox, and then maybe we can reconsider. But of course they didn't do that. So it is their fault. No, this is Father Ricosa, not talking about anti-modernists in this case, but talking about the modernizers. It is the fault of the modernizers if modernism has risen from its ashes and triumphed, as the great Monsignor Benigni feared. So this is Monsignor Benigni. Modernism, finally, was vanquished by Pius X. But it was organized into doctrinal modernism. In other words, the modernism that was vanquished by St. Pius X was the modernism that actually shows itself for what it is. Open, organized, and clearly, with its doctrines clearly stated. That kind of modernism is the modernism that was vanquished by St. Pius X. But the condition of the modernist soul remains. The modernizers who will not be defeated, but by virtue of more serious theological instruction, endlessly reminding Catholics of the objective truths which are the very foundation, in some sense, of the Church. So this is Benigni's assessment of the situation, that you're not that simply to lay down a condemnation and leave it at that is not enough. That you have to, for one thing, enforce those condemnations. Otherwise, it just remains, in a sense, a dead letter. It has to be enforced. Anybody who comes out as adhering to those errors must be brought to heel. And those who are actually sincere must be instructed constantly and guarded against those errors, lest they fall into them, perhaps unwittingly. But then, even somebody who, of course, falls into error even unwittingly, will still suffer from that. Somebody who's even in good faith will suffer detriment for having swallowed error. Something like swallowing poison accidentally. You'll still suffer from it. Whether or not you die from it is another question, but you still at least suffer badly from that. So, because it's true that ideas have consequences. If we do not, as it has been said, if we do not act in accordance with our beliefs, we'll end up believing in accordance with our actions. So, someone whose beliefs clearly then are erroneous, whose principles are somehow false or have erred in some way, will find themselves acting in false and in some way evil ways because of his false principles. And this, even if even if he has swallowed false principles in good faith, people will will come to certain conclusions, reasoning from their principles, and that can lead them very badly astray. Again, if they are truly in good faith, they will be happy to have it pointed out to them where they have gone wrong, but they could still suffer significantly in the meantime, even very, very badly. So with a modernizer, at least, in Rome, Roncalli, he was a modernist though, why wonder at the triumph of modernism since then? And that's Father Ricosa's question at the end of the first part of his Pope of the Council series, and we will definitely not go into every single thing that he talks about in that series. I do have to be somewhat picky here, but going on to now to the next section, or at least what is for now the next section, we will end up looking at certain other aspects, certain other things which Father Ricosa doesn't go into explicitly. He might mention in passing, but which for our purposes are actually very good to consider. But for the moment, we'll consider the fact that Don Roncalli was drafted into the Italian army on May 23rd, 1915, and attached to the health service at Bergamo. So here's some idea of the extent to which this new Italian kingdom, of course, having been in existence now for decades, but the extent to which that is anti-clerical, they have no problem clearly conscripting the clergy into the army. Well, something, a place where you have an ordered relationship between church and state, that would not happen, obviously. Yes, it is true, actually, that the state has the right to conscript members of its population into its armies for the purpose of fighting a just war, of course. But even that is heavily in question when it comes to Italian involvement in the First World War. Clearly, they were in it to gain territory, to bolster themselves and increase the extent of their influence. They had been in a triple alliance with Germany and Austria, and then switched sides when they saw, well, we could probably gain territory more easily from Austria than from France. So they decided to switch sides and then declared war on Austria. First, they did not even enter when, as part of the Triple Alliance, included going to war. One of the terms of that included going to war in favor of the other nations in the alliance. And so, indeed, when Germany and Austria went to war, each one was automatically at war with all of the enemies of the other. Whether or not there was actually any fighting between any two nations is another story. Let's look at all the details of how that unfolded. But in principle, all of the nations that with which one was at war, the other was also at war with. And see, that was how the war came about anyway. It was this extensive web of alliances involving everybody, almost everybody. At least everybody favored one or the other. That eventually, that was in a sense the nucleus around which everything else revolved. Was that alliance system, which itself, of course, could be looked at as the friction between France and Germany, the clearly irreconcilable enmity between the two of them was itself the nucleus around which that alliance system was founded. So you can go deeper and deeper into it. All very complicated, not our focus right now, but clearly a very problematic situation here of clergy being conscripted into the army to fight a war whose motives are highly suspect. Because, as with anything, in order that a war be just, the motives for which it is being fought must be ordered. As with anything. That's true with regard to anything, and that is in fact one of the conditions of a just war. If you look it up in any of the moral theologians, that's what they all say that. There has to be even if there is objectively reason to fight a war, a nation might be unjust in actually declaring war and fighting it if their motives are not actually ordered. If maybe there is objectively a reason, but that's not actually why they go to war. then that war is unjust. So that's not to say that everybody who is conscripted into those armies is sinning in conforming to that. Not necessarily. But it does mean that if the motive is not pure, then those who is not correctly ordered, then those who declare that war are really just going into mass murder. So certainly the motives of the Kingdom of Italy in going to that war were suspect, and then yes, they're not even exempting the clergy from their conscriptions. So it was actually even in the U.S. For a while anyway, the clergy, even certainly the priests, Catholic priests, were exempt from any kind of conscription. But for a long time, actually, even seminarians were as well. If you there was the famous ranking system for those who were fit for armed or for service in the armed forces, and those who were not. So 1A were those who were most suited. So young men within a certain age range, it was an established age range, who were unmarried, who had jobs that were probably didn't require any kind of great skill. It was they who were most likely to be conscripted, so drafted into the U.S. Army or any branch of the service that conscripted people. And it went all the way down to 4F. And if you actually look at it, so 4F were people who were probably wheelchair bound and mentally retarded. People who clearly there was absolutely no way these people would ever be able to contribute anything to a war effort. But when you actually look at the breakdown of all those different categories, in the 4D tier were included divinity students, among whom were considered to be Catholic seminarians. So it's just right above those who were the very most unsuited to service. So that was, in itself, that's a good thing. But after a while, in fact, that was actually done away with, and all was just based on, this was during the Vietnam War, but after a while, it all became simply based on random drawings of different dates, and anybody whose birthday was on that date was conscripted. So, you can ask His Excellency who mentioned that when that change of policy was enacted, that a great many seminarians just left because that was the only reason they had entered the seminary, was to avoid the draft. So there was a lot of that was the last time that a draft has been called up in the U.S. was during the Vietnam era, which turned out to be tremendously unpopular. Ultimately, there were anti-draft riots. That was a very tumultuous time in the U.S. All of these young people at the time were all being infected with all of this, with communist ideology. And so the idea of fighting a war whose express purpose was to prevent the spread of communism was not something particularly popular with them, to say the very least. But all of that is interesting, but it's not directly to our point here. But the point is that even the U.S., United States, are always, from the beginning, a nation of professed religious indifferentism, was able to come up with policies more favorable to the church than the formerly very strongly Catholic Italy. By that time, and having been forged into still culturally Catholic, it is very much a part of Italian culture to be Catholic, at least in name, perhaps, but to the fervor of the practice of it, or any practice at all of it, is another question entirely. But Italy, by this time, had no problem conscripting the clergy. As did also France, for example, in the Napoleonic era, very famously, Saint Jean Vianney, the Curé of Ars, of course, he, as a seminarian, he was at one point conscripted into Napoleon's armies. In fact, more than once. On one occasion, one of his brothers took his place. But on another occasion, he was unable to find a substitute, and certainly his parents were too poor to pay any kind of exemption fee that there might have been. He was actually drafted into the army, but he never ended up fighting. He ended up deserting by accident. There was a famous story of that. They had a few other men with whom he had been conscripted. They were traveling to join the army. and they decided to stop. They took a break on their journey, and he decided to step into the nearest church to pray. And then by the time he came out, the others had left, and he didn't know where they were, and so he ended up being led by a man who turned out himself to be a deserter to a place where deserters were hiding. So he was left with no choice but to be a deserter, and had to spend the rest of Napoleon's era, the rest of the Napoleonic era, hiding out. It was towards the end of it. He didn't have to hide out for that long, but he ended up. There was a general amnesty granted at a certain point, and he came out of hiding at that point. That's it, as I recall. That's what happened. But certainly, he was able to return to pursuing the priesthood. Although even then, actually, it was not at the final downfall of Napoleon that he was able to come out of hiding, because actually his first mass, he said, during the final Allied invasion of France, which brought down Napoleon in 1814, and so he said his first mass in between two Austrian army chaplains whose army was invading France. They were saying their mass in the morning. He said his first mass in between them. So he said his mass in a sense in the midst of an invading army, his first mass. That was all about 100 years prior to what we're looking at here. But he was drafted in 1915 and attached to the health service at Bergamo. He left the army on December 10th, 1918, although the official papers discharging him were dated February 28th and March 15th of 1919. So remember that the armistice was signed November 11th, 1918. That's when it went into effect. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And after that, the various armies disbanded. Roncalli emerged from the Great War physically unscathed. But it was not so with the spiritual war that St. Pius X waged against the modernist heresy throughout his pontificate from 1903 to 1914. Some of which we have already seen, those with whom he was close or at least allied in some way, that they came under suspicion. And the Pope was well aware, that is St. Pius X, was well aware that errors would not exist without erring men to profess them. Again, errors are not Platonic. As to say, there are no subsistent forms of errors floating in the clouds by themselves that are unassailable. Errors exist in the minds of those who invent them and spread them, and then thereafter in the minds of those who are perhaps infected with them in good faith, but they still continue to be spread. So St. Pius X, understanding this very clearly, that errors do not exist without erring men to profess them, took measures, as we've seen, very strong measures, although perhaps in retrospect we can only wish that they had been stronger. He took very strong measures to repress those errors, to discipline those who held them, did everything he could, in other words, to extirpate that error from the minds of anybody who may have imbibed them, and disciplined those who refused to get rid of them. So in this war against modernism and the modernists, Roncalli came to the attention of Cardinal Delay, who in 1914 began to suspect the orthodoxy of the future John the 23rd, so that it makes one think of a soldier who, having come unscathed through a long and arduous war, narrowly escapes being wounded on the eve of the armistice. So remember Cardinal Delay. He's on the list of cardinals put together by the Sodalitium as being anu, with us. So somebody who is very much in agreement with St. Pius X's methods for dealing with modernism. So Cardinal Delay, very, very much according to that alignment, is on to Roncalli in June 1914. But notice the date there, June 1914. In July, the whole world would get caught up in in August anyway, the whole world would get caught up in the war. That was just breaking out, and St. Pius X would die. Even in July, that month was consumed with the July crisis, as it was called, all of the diplomatic maneuverings that ultimately culminated in the outbreak of the war in August. And all of that bringing about the end of the reign of St. Pius X, certainly, bringing about the end of those firm and stern measures against modernism. For, according to this author, the whirlwind of modernism had blown itself out. It ended with the death of St. Pius X in August of that same year. So, of course, modernism had not actually been blown out. It had one form of it had been crushed, certainly, had been exposed for what it was, but it was not gone, as Bing himself noted. This tendency is not gone. This tendency is still it exists in the minds of the modernizers. So his successor, Benedict XV, certainly condemned modernism, but he did not continue the pursuit of the modernists. So this really is the big difference between St. Pius X and his successors. Not that Benedict XV, Pius XI, or Pius XII were modernists or modernizers themselves. Perhaps they may have, in some cases, conceded too much to modernists, as we actually will see that among, the generally excellent encyclicals of Pius XII, that still allows too much latitude to people. It certainly it appears that way in retrospect, allows too much latitude to modernists. That clearly presumes them to be of much better will than they actually are. And we'll see that. At least in some instances, we'll see that. Again, it will be in the midst of of many excellent things that he says, but he does allow that. So the big difference between St. Pius X and his successors was in exactly this, their methods of dealing with modernism. And really, it can only be reduced to a supernatural spirit that St. Pius X had that the others were somehow lacking. In other words, St. Pius X had no care for human respect. That all the arguments, you notice, against dealing with modernism with the necessary firmness, the firmness that St. Pius X clearly deemed it to be necessary, were reduced to that. That this will turn people off, this will offend people. Remember, all the talk of wounded souls and tormented consciences and all of that. All of that is something that anybody who may have been traumatized by it, of course, that's someone suffering trauma is a thing in itself unfortunate. But if that was an accidental effect of the necessary condemnation and repression of modernism, then that's perhaps as unfortunate as it is, something that could not be avoided. Again, that it was not St. Pius X who desired that. He did not desire that anybody be scarred for life because of his condemnation of error. But the error must be condemned. Somebody getting caught in a sense, flying debris from the necessary destruction of error is perhaps that's unfortunate, whatever form that might take. But the error cannot be allowed to stand because of any unfortunate side effects. Certainly, the good brought about by St. Pius X, we can say that in retrospect, definitely. The good brought about by his condemnation of error far exceeds any kind of personal trauma that may have been suffered along the way by anybody. And there was certainly, for every story of somebody, though, who may have claimed to be scarred or wounded in some way by all of it, you can come up with another story of many who were very happy that this was done. Recognized it as necessary and appreciated it very much. So, sometimes people might be, they might react badly to having their errors condemned. Think of the 19th century liberals such as Lamennais. Reacted very badly to the condemnation of his errors. Apostatized from the priesthood, abandoned the faith, and died impenitent to all appearances. That does not mean that his errors should not have been condemned. It's typical that heretics dig in their heels when their errors are condemned rather than admitting that they ought to have been submissive to the church from the start. That's typical. And it should not be surprising to us that that should be the case with regard to modernists, whose errors are, as St. Pius X described them, the synthesis of all heresies. Remember, we talked about all that last year, but the synthesis of all heresies, in as much as every heresy that has ever appeared attacks one or another truth of the faith. But modernism strikes at the very root even of the notion of objective truth. In that sense, striking at all of the truths of faith all at the same time. Striking at the very deepest root of it all, from which all the others come up. And that, in that way, modernism attacks every single truth of the faith. And clearly you can see that in the modernists themselves. They end up denying every single truth of the faith. You can look at all the things they've denied, it leaves just about nothing untouched. And certainly in the case of the Novus Ordo today, do they believe even one of the truths of the faith? When you have Bergoglio denying the existence of, saying that there is no Catholic God, and saying things that can only lead you to conclude that he denies the divine essence. Is there anything they left untouched? Clearly that is the synthesis of all heresies, which then leads to the assertion of every single heresy, clearly.